In this podcast, I'm going to show the story from 2001 up to 2003 before I launch a federal police investigation against the Johns Hopkins institutions. The octopus seems to be pretty good at making people billionaires if you're on the inner circle, particularly if you're working on areas of national security. And this seems to be why they get away with it. I mean, Ted Shackley, obviously handling very important national security matters, means that he has clearance, that he can use the infrastructure and all the institutions to carry out what's legitimate work, but at the same time move drugs and arms illegally through because it's classified as national security, and you need top national security clearance to be able to work in those areas or to ask questions or to see information. So that's how organised crime, particularly an organised criminal octopus with 8 legs, can actually have such far reach across not just the USA but into other countries like Australia. So this is now moving on to the next stage, where my whole encryption companies and partnerships with the world leading trusted institutions, I thought, Johns Hopkins, together with the Australian federal government, together with United Nations SEAL program, KPMG, and credible investors, and also the top national healthcare foundations. I mean, I'm dealing with the top, the chair, the experts, all signing confidentiality agreements so that we can all work together, establish trust, particularly when you're looking at global certification and authentication processes to protect the integrity of information and services that are being provided, and also the financial credibility of transactions, that they're all legitimate and can be audited and verified. So building trust means that we have to reach out. So I thought I saw my role was bridging the trust between Australia, USA, who I'd been extremely loyal for most of my life, and also with Europe to bridge the gap there. And a project like this is what we launched. Now, just to let you know, we're now, Carlos Morea, head of the United Nations SEAL program, was destroyed, called back to face a General Assembly UN inquiry into how it could be possible that a bogus prince could appear on national and international TV making a donation of $1 billion, destroy the credibility of organisations like theirs, and also the alliances that we had with the Australian federal government and institutions that I was representing. So he went back to Geneva, and the inquiry had completed, and they'd cleared him. It was embarrassing, but nothing wrong there. And so he started his own company called Wisekey, which was setting up a root key in a secure computer bunker located in a military bunker under the Swiss Alps, and you can only get there by flying in by military helicopter. And the purpose of doing that is it guarantees security in the event of a world crisis such as nuclear war. Then this secure root key will be protected for all banks, the telecommunications union for all communications across countries worldwide, healthcare records, government records, and such forth. And as I had finished a federal parliamentary privileges inquiry, I'd received a public apology in the parliament. Unfortunately, I didn't get any financial compensation for the threats made against me, but I did receive an apology. And so he asked me to come across to Geneva and continue the work that we wanted to do, and that was to set up a medical root authority for certification and also authentication of clinical records with the World Health Organization, the government of Geneva, and he had been approached by Johns Hopkins, who knew me and knew him from the work we did in Australia, and they would like to be part of the new strategy. So let me tell the story. So I move across to Geneva, and that's Carlos Morea above and myself as the author below, and we agree that we can set up a medical route authority for healthcare. We're going to link it with the credibility of the World Health Organization, and we've got John Hopkins wanting to be part of it, and Medbiquitus. And it turns out that a Dr. Peter Green was at a conference, bumped into Carlos and his directors, and they told him that they knew John Hopkins through Peter Osborne. And so they asked if I would come across to John Hopkins and put together a strategy with him to set up a route authority for certification of trust for healthcare. And of course we can bring together John Hopkins, all the institutions worldwide for standards of communications in technology and communications for delivering clinical services. And of course the World Health Organization and the state government of Geneva provides neutrality for our neutral key, which would be a root key for linking all of the different levels of trust together. So we both, Carlos and I, agree, let's start again. And so this is where we are. We've survived, we've gone through the bogus prints that later we prove is a CIA operation that has destroyed the credibility of the United Seal, and now we're starting again. I've passed through this stage, which is a privileges committee. I've received a public apology, and I then make contact with William Hamilton for the first time, identifying that it's Rupert Murdoch's company that actually sold the PROMIS software to the Australian government. So while that is going on in the background, I'm invited across starting in 2001 to put together a partnership with John Hopkins and Wisekey, World Health Organization and the government of Geneva. So just to remind you, it takes 21 years to look at the patterns and descriptions when we have the brightest minds, Niels Bohr, Max Planck and Richard Feynman. I mean, they're my heroes, and particularly Richard Feynman. When we analyse all the patterns and behaviour, then it's only then we can weave together a fabric that can reveal what nature is, and that's the same for the nature of this octopus. It's taken me 21 years. Again, this particular podcast is about the Five Eyes and ECHELON. And as the Cold War deepened, the intelligence sharing arrangement became formalised under ECHELON. So in Australia, that's located at Pine Gap. And it is a jointly run CIA-NSA facility on Australian soil, and it's not controlled by the Australian government, even though it's in our intelligence, even though it's on Australian soil. That is something that Gough Whitlam found difficult to understand, and Dr. Jim Cairns, hence the Loans Affair. And so therefore we're looking at the fact that ECHELON is far-reaching, and if it had good purposes but had been infiltrated and hijacked by the Octopus, a corrupt organisation of Ted Shackley, then the Six Eye can spy on the Five Eyes. And that's what my book was going to be all about, but I've decided that I'm going to do at least maybe 40 to 50 different podcasts on all the research material I've got. So this is really about ECHELON. And as I say, I am going through the steps of all the evidence of the brilliant work that Danny Casolaro was doing. He really was going to expose the Octopus, the secret team, and Michael Riconosciuto. Both of them have sealed files, Executive Order B1. Michael's B2 and B3, which are NSA classification and CIA, and hence Michael was allowing him to understand some components and threads that allowed him to weave a bit more of the garment that the Octopus was taking. And Danny was brilliant. He was putting all the pieces together, and the evidence that I've shown in earlier podcasts show that he was going to expose them, and he would have won an award, but instead our governments allowed for the octopus to murder him. And summary for myself, for those that are watching this podcast but haven't seen the previous ones, I recommend you go back to the previous. But I am a physicist and mathematician and expertise in computing, signal processing, image processing. I thought I was smart until I started communicating with Michael Riconosciuto in 2004, and he is a genius. But he's so relieved to speak to someone like me who understands the modifications he made, how ECHELON works, and that way he can focus on telling me how it works, what it does, where you can find it, rather than trying to explain the technical matters all the time. So he's taken me into his trust from 2004 to 2021, and we still speak on a daily basis, and he's pleased that I'm putting these podcasts out. So key part was, I exposed that it was Rupert Murdoch that sold the PROMIS software to the Australian government. They validated independently Michael's whole testimony that he gave in court that was ignored. And it was true, because I used to work for his company and I know what they do, how they did it. And their biggest client was the US Secretary of State and the US Treasury, Secretary of Treasury, which was James Baker. Hence, you just have to follow the money. In 1998, we've covered the last podcast, the United Nations SEAL program, credible program, years of investment of work with highly credible people to build trust for trade between Australia, China, all the countries of Asia, plus also Europe, was destroyed by a CIA operation, and it's called Still Point. And so these podcasts are completed, a summary of what I've completed in research over 21 years. The book is just too big, too complicated. No one reads books nowadays, but I think if I break it down to 40, maybe 60 podcasts, I can elaborate on the evidence and facts so that people stop talking about conspiracy and start to be educated of how the world really works. And who was the secret team, and what do they do? So, we've completed the bogus prints. I've passed through a privileges committee. I've made contact with William Hamilton to actually introduce myself. He was in shock when I asked him, did he know the name of Rupert Murdoch's company? It was called Computer Power Group. It developed all the court retrieval software. It also developed the lean software, which was sold to the Australian government. It was his distributor. They approached him at a hotel in Boston in 1982, requesting to become his distributor of the PROMIS software. He did not know that their client was the US Secretary of State and the US Treasurer. They also had partnerships with Wang Labs and also with several other companies that had all the contracts with CIA to develop all the integrated database retrieval systems and office automation systems for everyone in CIA, every embassy, every senator, every governor, everyone in DIA, everyone in NSA. Hence, they were working on PROMIS. And then it was put into originally it was put in to track Soviet nuclear submarines. Hence, it was put onto the Trident submarines. Originally, that was the original application because of its architecture and sophistication to integrate vast quantities of data from multi-vendor databases, distributed systems, parallel systems, and that was the major advantage of Bill Hamilton's software at the time. But it then was modified and put into the banking system. It was installed at Transaction Technologies at Citibank. It went into the banks worldwide. It meant the octopus could move funds, covert funds, secretly through SWIFT transfers of all automatic clearinghouses and banks worldwide, but not only move things, they could monitor and track and listen. And so it becomes a great economic espionage tool, which bankrupted the Soviet Union, but it also is used to control all countries worldwide and politicians and anyone that they need to control. It's all about following the money. It's given to the authorities, law enforcement, intelligence, so they can track criminals and organised crime and also terrorist activities, but it's the fox looking after the chicken coop. They actually are watching and can see in real time what it is that's being investigated, what evidence is coming that could be damaging to CIA or covert, such as Iran-Contra, Iraq-Gate, or transactions of drugs and money laundering. They can disguise it and prevent being caught. In fact, the software only allows you what you need to see. So they can mask all transactions that are covert. No one sees it, it's not detected by the software that they're looking at. So let's continue on. We're now in 2001, just before I'm launching a federal police investigation against John Hopkins. At this stage, I didn't know that CIA had brought down this. I found that a bit later in 2001 when the court came out. So we're in 2000, and I believe that John Hopkins is still my ally, my friend, since 1993 and 94. And I've opened all the doors for them to sit and be with our ministers, cabinet ministers, treasurers, and governments, federal and state, plus all my investors. And as I repeat to you, I fly backwards and forwards to John Hopkins. I'm sitting in the room, the office of the Chief Attorney, Mr. Samuel Clark Jr., who is the attorney and chief counsel to the Board of Trustees, who's picking the phone up and speaking to the politicians and inviting them to John Hopkins, and speaking directly to all the heads of foundations while I'm in the room with him, and speaking to the government officials, federal and state, and speaking to all my investors, hospitals, clients, investors. So for John Hopkins, on national TV, 7:30 Reporter and SBS, which I'll get to show you, deny that they ever knew me, had any relationship with me. You cannot get any closer than Peter Osborne sitting in the room of the office of the Chief Attorney and Chief Counsel to the Board of Trustees, to the President, to the CEO, on the Board of Trustees, with all of them investing in partnerships with me in Australia and ask me to be their CEO, backwards and forwards. Well, this is going to open your eyes of what they did do and why they deny it. So let's go and look at the story. Just to remind you, if you haven't seen the previous, I was the former science advisor to Honourable John Howard's Federal Liberal Party in Australia. He became the Prime Minister from 1996 to 2007. During all this time, I'm trusted. I've done very, very honourable things for the federal government, the state government, and also the taxpayers of Australia. And I'm known to be honest, and I'm known to try and build partnerships of trust. I've got a history of doing it over 40 years. So for anyone to question your credibility, and that's what they do. The octopus questions everyone's credibility and thinks that they can just get away with it. So just to recap, last podcast, we had put together over 2 years a United Nations SEAL trading program for secure electronic authenticated link for doing transactions of trade, electronic trade, from a hub established in Australia with the United Nations SEAL trade point, and then linking into all countries worldwide. Australia was going to be the base of the hub and the infrastructure. So I opened the door to the federal government support and the Deputy Prime Minister, Tim Fischer, with the blessing of the Minister, Honourable Fran Bailey, flew to John Hopkins after having the telephone call with Sam Clark Jr. and myself and Kerry Creers, the business development manager from the office. And she accepted that, and she flew across like I did multiple times, and they looked after her, and she was fully endorsing our programs for setting up Global View certification and the UN Seal for Healthcare with Trusted Organisation of John Hopkins. Then this prince appears. He appears November 1997 on national TV and international. CNN's broadcasting it live. The Australian TV channels are putting it on the TV the next night. They had all the information within less than 24 hours after he in the country for days. He stays for a week with a full delegation of intelligence people from UK, intelligence people from USA, all around him, staying at the hotel with him for a week after the disaster, and within 24 hours of his appearance, it's on the front page that the guy's a fraud, and it disgraces everybody, government officials, myself, plus also Carlos Morea, and brings down everyone who's associated with the United Nations SEAL program. As I said to you last, is that there was a formal General Assembly inquiry. It finished and was published on the 29th of September 1999. This is just as I'm launching my Privileges Committee. They came to the conclusion that it was embarrassing, but Carlos Morea had not done anything wrong. It was a huge embarrassment. It was this fraudulent, bogus prince who's making a $1 billion donation live on TV and brought the program down. So Carlos has started a new company called Wisekey. I received a call from him. He wanted me to come across and help him set up a medical root authority based in Geneva using the root certification computer, which is located in a military bunker under the Swiss Alps, and the only way you can get to the bunker is by flying in by helicopter and passing security to get into where the key is. And so it's got a root encryption key that no one can get to, and in the event of nuclear war or some worldwide crisis, the computer and root key will not be destroyed and the server will still be operational. So it means that phones, telephones, communications will still be working and using encryption, and also all banking transactions, government records, and also medical records would be secure. So it's a wonderful idea, and with Geneva being neutral, we wanted to build a neutral environment for collaboration between all countries, again, to be able to share a root key of trust and to be able to provide services. And the area that I was going to be heading was the medical root, health root, public key infrastructure for the internet. And so I was appointed as the director for Wisekey's Health Technology Services. I was very pleased. I was going to move my family across. All of our work that we'd done in Australia was destroyed, so I figured why not start again in Geneva. At 21 I had studied in Berlin at Max Planck Institute, Fritz Haber Institute, and loved Berlin and felt, well, perhaps that's where my future is. I did my best in Australia. Let's go off to Europe and let's just do things, and hopefully they won't be destroyed again. Well, I was wrong. So it turns out that Wisekey had been approached at an international conference in Europe, and Dr. Peter Green, representing John Hopkins Medicine and MedBiquitous, approached them and expressed interest in the concept of a root key for integrating all data, and wanted to know more about it. So they said, look, we'll fly Peter Osborne across to John Hopkins. He's worked with you before, you all know him. And so it was arranged that I would fly across representing Wisekey. We would do a live conference call from John Hopkins with all the parties, and if they're interested, which they were, then perhaps we could do an alliance. And this is what we were thinking of: a root key link between Johns Hopkins, considered #1 trusted medical institution in the world, together with MEDDROOT, together with the World Health Organization and the government of Geneva. Let's put together a root certification authority. So everyone's interested, so I fly off and I meet at Johns Hopkins Medicine, and the meetings are set up and I enter the room. So Carlos and I are convinced this is the way to do it. This time we can control the process. Now you must remember, Carlos and I do not know at this stage that it was CIA that destroyed our last program. It was a CIA Operation Still Point with that prince. That I didn't find out until 2001. End of 2001 is when I found the court case linking the evidence. So I'm flying off. So the parties involved, there's a photograph of us. I do the conference call. I attend a conference for a week with Johns Hopkins Medicine. They then take me out to meet all the directors of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. I know it well. My degrees and research degrees are in applied physics, and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics is considered one of the top institutions of the world. I've studied at Max Planck, considered one of the top in the world in Berlin, and over here this is equivalent for the US side. So I felt that now we've got a real team of trust. I'm trying to bridge trust between America for encryption and security. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics, I know, does all of the security encryption work with NSA, FBI and CIA and defense. So you have to be cleared to do that. I had represented Spirus and KPMG's technologies, the Rosetta chip, which is used by them, and that's what I tried to do in Australia. So I thought I was considered trusted, and maybe we could bridge this, that the Europeans will trust, and I can play that role, which I do. I've done it before. So I attend a meeting with all directors of Johns Hopkins. I had to put my passport. They took a copy at the security office to get in. There's a Marine standing there, or 2 Marines standing there, because of the national security aspects of it. So they have a copy of my Australian passport on the week of the 5th of June. During that week, I attended a meeting for an hour and a half with about 6 directors of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics, plus also Dr. Peter Green, Kerry Kriz, and also another Dr. Mohin. So I will talk about that a bit later. So meetings are all held. At this meeting, they express interest, strong interest, so much so that they're impressed with our strategy, that Johns Hopkins and the Applied Physics, Johns Hopkins Medicine, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics, with Peter Green, with the directors of Amcare Labs, expressed that they would like to invest $20 million to become a partner in Wisekey. They wanted to buy into Wisekey so that they'd have equity in the whole program when we get it going. So those discussions take place. So this is Dr. Peter Green. He officially represents Johns Hopkins Medicine and MEDDROOT Consortium. He's responsible for all the Chief of Information Systems for Johns Hopkins and Emerging Technologies. He was controlling the whole process for this meeting. He arranged this meeting, and I flew across at the request of Johns Hopkins and to represent Wisekey to put this all together. So when I arrive, the conference room, there's Peter Green, there's Kerry Kriz, who I'm feeling a bit nervous because we had some problems still in Australia that he was intimately involved with, but it had left a bit of a mess after the United Nations SEAL program, and also the governments were confused because he had insisted that they sign confidentiality agreements on everything to protect the patents that we were putting forward for the certification authority, for the encryption certificates and other aspects of telehealth, which we all did, all government officials, heads of foundations and such forth. So it was mandated that they had to sign those with the joint ventures that we were setting up. In the room was also Mohan Chalapa. I'd met him before at Singapore, and I'd met him on previous trips. They are both directors of Amcare Labs, and Frank Bosnell is also a director and a major investor in it, and he represents, he's on the board of Johns Hopkins Medicine, but he also is a previous former general partner of Alex Brown and Sons. He owns the biggest venture groups. So the workshop takes place, and they bring into the room and introduce me to this man, David Wong. He goes by the name of David Wong. That's what he was introduced to me. This is a copy of his passport. We had the conference call. They were so excited. They said they wanted to invest $20 million from Johns Hopkins and Amcare Labs. The directors had decided that they wanted to get in, and they requested that David Wong would represent their investment into Wisekey. So it seemed a bit strange, but David Wong, they told me, works with Johns Hopkins in Singapore and America, is very trusted, well known by them, and he's done many ventures with them. So I meet David Wong. They say that he's going to fly across to Geneva, and Peter Green flew across so that we could do the signing of the agreements. But the investment of $20 million was on behalf of Johns Hopkins Medicine, Medbiquis, and Amcare Labs. It was very specific that David Wong would be representing their investments, and he wanted to get in because he wanted to get the rights for the encryption keys for the Chinese market. That's what he wanted to get the right for, and they told me categorically, and David Wong, all of them said that he had trained in the military in Israel and has a close relationship with Johns Hopkins, and also has very high level links with the Chinese military. And so they're hoping that he will be able to get the rights for the Wisekey to be able to sell. We didn't know he comes from Indonesia. I knew that he was from Singapore, but he's born in Indonesia. But he was in the room at Peter Green, Kerry Kriz, Mohan Chalapa and Frank Bosnell's request to represent their investment, to fly across to represent the $20 million. Other than that, I would never have met David Wong. Following the conference call, Peter Green, Kerry Kriz drove me immediately across to meet the directors of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics. So I had to check in there, and in a room, conference room, and there's, I think, 6 directors of Johns Hopkins with them, and they're explaining what the proposal is for the encryption key and the proposal that's going to be done with Wisekey. So it's highest levels of communications and interests of Johns Hopkins. It's not just Johns Hopkins, it's not just Medbiquis, it's not just the directors. It was 6 directors of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics. And of course, this is the official research centre for NSA, CIA, DIA, and FBI. So, everything's going well. Copies of my passport recorded for those meetings. I fly back to Australia and then fly on to Geneva again, and David Wong flies across to sign the agreements, and then Peter Green flies across with representatives. So this is the author here, this is me here, this is Carlos, that's the attorney for Wisekey, this is the representative of the Geneva government. And Malcolm Hutchison, also a fellow Australian who has been working with Carlos for many years and was involved with the United Nations SEAL program with me. In fact, the 3 of us were the ones that put it all together with the government support for the federal government, bringing Johns Hopkins in. And of course, Johns Hopkins has requested to be part of it again, and I'm the key person that's requested to bridge the partnership for this investment. Now, I've written down here that this I didn't know until 2004. I did not know until I started communicating with Michael Riconosciuto. He told me the original application for the PROMIS software was for the tracking of Soviet submarines, and it was actually installed in the fire control command systems of the Trident missile system on the Trident nuclear submarines on a VAX 11 780. I did not know that, and I did not know at the time, but Hadron, its largest client was Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. So why I put that in is, I mentioned to you that in 2000 I picked the phone up and called Bill Hamilton for the first time and introduced myself, and had identified and started the relationship in terms of helping him with his PROMIS software, that it was Rupert Murdoch's company that sold the PROMIS software to the Australian government. That's going on in the background. So all of a sudden, here I am. They've taken me out to Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory to meet face-to-face with 6 directors, and they're asking for a David Wong from Singapore, born in Indonesia, to represent their $20 million investment into Wisekey, to get access, to be a partner in a root certification authority computer hidden under the Swiss Alps in a military bunker that's going to be used by all governments of Europe, all telecommunication companies of Europe, and also Asian countries, South America, Asia, and also China. And remember, this root key they don't control. I arrived back from the signing of the agreements, and we've got Peter Green has returned from Geneva, signed the agreements to have a partnership to set up the root authority, and David Wong has flown across and signed the agreements and has, I think, 10 days to transfer the $20 million across before he can get the business and technical details of the root authority as a condition of investment. So the seed investment was 20 million, and of course more equity would come if they wanted to buy more. I received a telephone call in Australia from Dr. Peter Green. He calls me and tells me that he's sending a resume of Paul Stiles to me. I receive it, it's on the email, I open it up, he requests the confirmation I've got it, I have, and I've still got it today. He then tells me that as part of the agreed 20 million investment, can I arrange that Wisekey will employ Paul Stiles to work with them, and also have access to the Wisekey root computer encryption military security bunker. He's got excellent trusted expertise from his resume, and he says that he reminds me that Johns Hopkins Applied Physics is where he's trained, and they're the official R&D centre for FBI, which actually then prevents things like money laundering and such forth. Now, we're trying to build a system of trust. The US with Europe, and we've got fantastic experts in Europe, and they've got fantastic experts in the USA. But if we're all trying to do the right thing and such forth, then it sounds okay. He's asking me to pass on the resume, which I do, to Carlos Morea, and that way they can check him out. Well, he tells me categorically, before I've finished reading it, that Paul Stiles is a world expert on encryption security, and that the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory is the official trusted R&D centre for FBI. Well, everything seems okay. I mean, we're all honest, and we're all fighting crime, so we don't want the root keys being exploited by organised crime. And so this is his resume. US Naval Cryptology Officer, National Security Agency from 1988 to 1992. He also was working directly with Congressional Affairs Office, NSA Director's Staff, and was the liaison officer to the appropriate committee for the US House of Representatives and Congress presentations. Well, I've worked as a science advisor to the federal cabinet ministers and prime ministers and treasurers at the time, and also helped federal and state government ministers across all states. And so when you're trusted, and your advice is appreciated. So that seems okay to me. He's also managed NSA's side of critical year-long congressional investigations of American cryptology. So he clearly has the expertise in offensive encryption and also defensive. And he's also a special in economic intelligence matters. Well, that's what NSA does. It's economic espionage. That's what ECHELON is. Okay, so if they're being upfront about it with the resume, then they're not hiding anything, but his expertise may be of value to Wisekey, so I pass that on. And of course he's trained with US Navy as well in cryptology. It says that he was a founder of iJet Travel Intelligence, and it provides intelligence for business executives when they fly overseas to advise them in terms of threats, political threats, safety threats, healthcare alerts and that sort of stuff. But it seems pretty good. It's about capturing the best information and keeping the business executives up to date with warnings and prevention of terrorism and abductions, and also healthcare alerts. So that seems okay. Then he's got here that he actually was the author of Riding the Bull. It's his memoirs of when he worked at Merrill Lynch during the wild days of Wall Street. I'm sure you've probably seen the movies, of Wall Street. And he tells his story of what corruption was going on. So it looks like he's a pretty honest guy. I think it sounds okay to me. I have no reservations, so I pass it on. I checked on the internet and I found his book, Riding the Bull, and his story of what he found going on behind the scenes at Wall Street. I did a quick check for iJet and Unveil's travel agency. It does say that he's former National Security Agency operative, and they employ former intelligence people to work for providing intelligence to the business community. Okay, seems okay. So, summary was, they introduced into the room David Wong. His real name is Wong Kok Keon. The directors of Anker Labs, John Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, they introduced David Wong and tell me that he's going to be representing the $20 million investment for them, and he's looking to secure it for the rights for China. David Wong confirms he was trained in Israeli military. He flew across, he told me many times, and he has very high links with the Chinese military. Okay, well, David Wong, he signs the $20 million investment agreement with Wisekey. We take a copy of his passport for authentication of who we're dealing with. Everything's going fine. The 10 days is getting close. I've passed the resumes on to Carlos Morea from Paul Styles, and then there seems to be a delay. It's getting close to the deadline where he's due to pass the funds across, the $20 million. And we've got our attorneys in Switzerland with bank accounts for due diligence, an escrow account, and we're asking who is he going to be using for the escrow account from Singapore or the US, and he tells us that it's going to be Merrill Lynch, which is fine, but under Swiss law we need to verify who the source of the funds are. He makes an unusual request. Can he just bypass all the due diligence processes and just drop the 20 million cash in? Swiss, we can't do this, we say. This is Swiss law. At this stage we're starting to get really nervous. He repeats the request many times. He just wants to drop it in, bypass the processes. We've just been destroyed by a bogus prince. We sense this has all the signs of another US intelligence scam. To destroy our international credibility and trust, to provide encryption security services to international banks, hospitals and governments. We request verification of the source of the funds. We want, our attorneys say, get Merrill Lynch to contact us, we need them to verify the source of the funds. Only on those conditions can we verify that, and we're not breaching anything that to do with the Swiss banking laws for anti-money laundering regulations. This alarm bells are going up, and that's when David Wong mysteriously disappears off the face of the earth. He's gone. John Hopkins doesn't know where he is. That's what they say. The whole thing crashed. It became a disaster. The whole John Hopkins deal broke down. All we asked for was to obey Swiss law and for verifications of the source, the due diligence with escrow accounts, so that we could have it validated from credible sources that it's credible funds. It's not money laundering of drugs, organised crime. As we felt like we were going to be set up, and I believe we were being set up to be just like the bogus Prince scam all over again. Two birds with one stone. They destroy the credibility of Wisekey and Swiss government's root key, and they destroy my credibility given there's mounting evidence that Kerry Kriz, Sam Clark Jr., the attorney and chief counsel to the Board of Trustees, plus the doctors of John Hopkins, had defrauded the Australian governments, my companies, KPMG, foundations and investors for over 3 to 4 years, and their effort was to hope that we would be silly and just take the cash, and then they'd have a story running the next day that we've just taken drug money. And we were proven right. We then did research, and we found out that David Wong, who was introduced at the premises in the meeting by Peter Green, Kerry Kriz, and directors of John Hopkins Medicine, John Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, that their person was a known bankrupt back in 1985. That was the first search we found. Then we found that he was declared bankrupt again during the week that he's meeting with us. During my meetings at John Hopkins, I was there on the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. I flew out on the 9th. I've got my tickets, I've got my accommodation receipts, I've got the meetings. Whilst he's there, even the papers are saying that he is a bankrupt. Again, when I did research on the bankruptcy, it involved John Hopkins Singapore. He was involved with fraud involving John Hopkins. For this to be taking place while I'm sitting in a room with 6 directors of John Hopkins Applied Physics, 3 directors of Amcare Labs, a subsidiary of John Hopkins, and Medbiquitous, and directors of John Hopkins Medicine. It's almost as if they're trying to play typical intelligence, plausible deniability. We'd never be using someone who's a bankrupt. That's ridiculous. But they did. We've got their signatures, we've got the proof of the passport, we've got the tickets, we've got the meetings, we've got the photographs of them being in Geneva, and we were being set up. They were going to try and destroy 2 birds with one stone. This was again a CIA, NSA operation to kill us a second time off with our encryption root key business. They did it in Australia, and they're going to do it again one more time. And there it is. Now this is later. In 2001 is the meetings. 2001, the bankruptcies. And then in 2016, the same David trusted Wong that John Hopkins uses for their business representation of that 20 million was actually impersonating the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore and defrauding investors. And so he's sent to jail. There was a track record that you find in the media of who David Wong is, and the first principles of business is you want to know who you're dealing with. I was dealing with John Hopkins, all directors. So was Wisekey board. I was their director for the medical technologies and encryption key infrastructure. We were definitely dealing. We didn't meet David Wong. We didn't ask to meet him. He was brought into the meeting for them, and he was appointed as their representative. The meeting was initiated by Dr. Peter Green. He asked to be for us to come across and meet with them. He asked for us to provide an opportunity for investment. Kerry Chris asked. The directors of Amcare were fully behind it. Medbiquitous was fully, and John Hopkins Medicine. So it was clear to us this was another attempt to destroy us. It certainly destroyed immediate business and opportunities for me in Geneva, because again it proved embarrassing. We've got a bankrupt, a bogus person turning up. It's like the same thing happening again to Carlos Moreira was happening again to him and to me. And it's all got a common link of John Hopkins. John Hopkins Applied Physics, John Hopkins, NSA, CIA, all over it. So let's go one step further. So now they've destroyed this. I've proven it was CIA operatives that set this thing up. I've proven that CIA was setting up, and so was NSA, and I'll prove it now. We're setting us up to try and take us down, to destroy because I'm about to launch a federal police investigation of fraud against John Hopkins directors, given that I'm uncovering even more evidence that the IP was plagiarised that they sold to me, and not only that, they stole my IP in my patents. Not only that, they were running off and raping all my investors and business partners behind my back. It's the most unethical behaviour for any trusted institution to do. So let's go back and have a look at Paul Stiles. They're wanting me to employ him and his links into NSA encryption. Now, in 2004, I make the first contact with Michael. Michael said to me, Peter, do you know there's a group higher than CIA and NSA? George Pender on the FIDCO board represented CSS, Central Security Service. The chief of Central Security Service is always the director of NSA. And they usually employ a civilian who will become the deputy with an expertise in encryption technologies. This is exactly like FIDCO in its operations, in the way they behave. So let me go one step further. All right, it's obvious he's with NSA, ECHELON. That's what PROMIS is being modified for. As soon as I contact Michael in 2004 by letter, and he gives me the transcripts of his court testimony and starts writing back to me, he's so relieved that he's got someone that understands physics and maths and technologies and computing that he can just tell me what the modifications do. And this is what I found when I went back to iJet. iJet was founded by Paul Stiles and Bruce McIndoe. The corporate documents that I uncovered, there are directors, founders of it, but Paul McEnroe is not just NSA, he's the lead architect for the whole of NSA and US government, both of them trained through Johns Hopkins. He's the lead architect for ECHELON. ECHELON 2. I then discovered that their company employs former NSA, CIA, KGB, South African intelligence services, and their major client is the World Bank and IMF, and hence PROMIS. ECHELON, the modifications of PROMIS was for ECHELON, and I am being introduced to the key lead architects who are all over me, wanting me to use David Wong, who's a known bankrupt, on the 85. On the days that I'm sitting in there with him in the room, he's bankrupt. It's on the front paper, in the papers in Singapore. They knew this. The man is a fraud. It was a front. If we had taken the money, it was the bogus Prince TV program running again in Europe and Australia to disgrace me and Carlos, kill off him and also kill off my career again so that I don't pursue federal police prosecutions against the directors of Johns Hopkins for fraud in Australia. And so here it is. It turns out that their company on September 1 was providing better services and intelligence than any other agency. Everyone was getting immediate, up-to-date terrorist intelligence activities on the day of September 11, faster than CIA could do it, FBI and also NSA. So they became and are considered the architects for immediate, real-time intelligence. And then this is it. While I was in Europe, there was the story of Parliament being aware for the first time about ECHELON. And it turns out the Danish Parliament and a parliamentarian there tracked down Bruce McIndoe to confirm that he is the lead architect of ECHELON. So I'm working with Paul Stiles. Paul Stiles founded iJet with him, and Bruce McIndoe is the lead architect for ECHELON for NSA since the 80s. And so they interview him, and it becomes apparent that Bruce McIndoe and Paul Stiles are the architects. We were being set up. They were trying to do two things. One, infiltrate the root key to compromise it so that they can decrypt everything for other countries worldwide. They were panicking about the root key. And two, I think they wanted us on TV like the day it happened back in Australia the first time. A bogus prince, media prepped up, story about to break. As soon as that money went into our account, it would have been declared it was drug money or criminal organisations or arms. And given that David Wong had trained with the Israeli military, then it must have been a joint intelligence operation where he takes a fall, goes to prison, but they've destroyed a root key under the Swiss Alps. I think that's what it really was. It was definitely a rerun of what happened before. I didn't know until late 2001 when the court case came out that the bogus prince had already had meetings with CIA operatives reporting to George Tenet 6 months before he flew to Australia. And now you look back, how does a prince come into Australia with a delegation from UK, USA, be declared a fraud on the Saturday night, And on the TV on the Sunday and Monday night, the full story that he's a failed builder from Queensland, abandoned his family and is a fake, they had the story all prepared. But this is the part, the story runs. And he stays at the hotel in Melbourne, one of our top, with his delegation for over a week, 7 more days. There was ample opportunities for the authorities of Australia or FBI to move in and arrest him if he is fraud. I don't believe he was a fraud. I believe that he is CIA, and I believe that he was part of their operation. And the next podcast, I'm going to blow your mind apart with the evidence of God, of who the prince was, who he was working with, and it goes all the way to President Clinton, and it goes all the way to President Bush. This is the octopus. This is hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud going on and scams, but it is the octopus. So I'll prove it to you. Now this is the last part, if you may remember. My last podcast had shown that Danny Casolaro had met Joseph Queller. And Joseph Queller was working for Business Risk International. And 2 weeks before Danny dies, Kroll Associates was making an acquisition agreement for Business Risk International. And Kroll was contracted to the US Treasury, James Baker, and the Kuwait royal family to recover all of the stolen gold bullion and also stolen arts and oil reserves and currency and money laundering operations of Saddam Hussein. Kroll Associates also had previously represented ENCRYPTION to investigate the theft of their PROMIS software. And look what's happening here. Paul Stiles, Bruce Macken, a few months later, after the big scam with David Wong, the bankrupt, Kroll is acquiring them. I've got the articles of association, the news. They are acquired by Kroll Inc. Wherever there's corruption, major cases, Kroll's there. The Vatican Bank, BCCI, Robert Maxwell, Empire. Whenever there's intelligence that's embarrassing to the US intelligence agencies, Kroll comes in. Its job is to find the evidence and bury it. I'm just going to go back to my previous ones. I'm launching a police investigation now. I've been defrauded by the board of directors of Johns Hopkins Medicine, and on the board is A.B. Krongard, who became the executive director of CIA, who's involved with PROMIS and Project Hammer. And I'm going to do a whole podcast just on him to show you who he is, what he's done, and why I've got Paul Stiles and Bruce Mackender and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics directors all sitting around a room with this David Wong. And then I've got Frank Bosnell, who's appointed David Wong to represent their company to invest the 20 million. And I discovered that he owned Business Risk International in 1991 with Donald Walker, who employed Joseph Queller, who set up the meeting for Danny Casolaro. There are too many coincidences to be coincidences. There he is on the board with Don Walker in 1991 and employed Joseph Queller. He is a director of Amcare Labs with Kerry Creers, and Johns Hopkins Medicine's on the board, and they were setting up the $20 million investment with David Wong. David Wong was in the room, introduced by AmCare Labs International, John Hopkins, to make that investment, and he was known to be a bankrupt. Just to repeat, Kroll Associates announced their agreed acquisition of Business Risk International on July 22, 1991. Danny's found dead on the 10th of August, and it was Joseph Queller, working for Business Risk International, who set that meeting up for Danny. He claimed that he personally knew Peter Wiedniks, and he was going to set this meeting up with Robert Altman, given Danny had the BCCI signed cheques. And of course, Kroll Associates acquiring Business Risk, and they're tracking all the Kuwait assets hidden by Iraq's Saddam Hussein. Billions of dollars. Too much of a coincidence that Joseph Queller on the left of Danny flies back from Kuwait from Desert Storm and bumps into him by chance, showing his Business Risk International business card. And on the right, Robert Booth Nichols urgently flies back to meet with Danny. And he is also helping the Kuwait royal family recover all the stolen gold and art. In fact, he even says he's setting up a command centre in Dominican Republic to rebuild Kuwait. This is just too much of a coincidence. But more important, 2004, when I'm prosecuting and getting a federal police investigation of fraud against all the John Hopkins directors, including AmCare Labs, that's when the mystery stake man turned up, who was Robert Booth Nichols, to make the threats against me, just like he did with Danny. So we now have too many coincidences, but I think without a doubt, the minute I was speaking to Michael Riconosciuto and Bill Hamilton, I think the machinery started. I'd already called Bill Hamilton, confirming categorically that it was Rupert Murdoch's company that sold the PROMIS software to the Australian government. It was renamed the Lean software, and then 3 years later, I make first contact with Michael Riconosciuto. He gives me a copy of the complete transcripts of his court testimony, which I've never seen, no one's seen, and there it is. First application is for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines, and its application was put onto the Trident submarines. Next podcast I'll show you that John Hopkins Applied Physics, the 6 directors that wanted to meet with me, were the biggest client of Hadron, and they developed the fire control and command systems for the Trident submarine. And I'll also show you that Bruce McIndoe founded the company that was contracted to design the software for the VAX 11 computer for the Trident fire control software for the Trident submarines. That's no coincidence. This is the end of this session. The evidence is that our whole Wisekey Medroot was destroyed by the CIA and NSA ECHELON team, including John Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, who were the largest client of Hadron Inc., that developed and installed the modified PROMIS software for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines for the fire control systems of the Trident submarine. This is no coincidence. This is real. I'll put the evidence up on the table to show you that things don't happen by chance. In 2004, the directors of AmCare Labs, John Hopkins Applied Physics, are worried. And that's when President Ford, on the board of Citibank, together with C. Michael Armstrong, the chairman of John Hopkins trustees, with John Deutsch, former director of CIA, intervene and want to assist me to get a negotiated $100 million settlement with the John Hopkins institutions. I agree, and then Robert Booth Nichols comes up and starts making threats against my life. They ran away as soon as they realised I had uncovered the CIA intervention with the bogus prints. I hadn't told anyone. As soon as I told them that I have the evidence, the Chief of Staff, Calvin McDowell, who worked for Gerald Ford, became very nervous and said, would I be willing to have a secure line installed at my house to provide my evidence that the CIA operatives destroyed the UN SEAL program with the bogus prints? And I said, yes, willing to do that. He disappeared. Completely disappeared. They no longer were representing me for my negotiation. That's when I discovered that C. Michael Armstrong, the chairman of John Hopkins trustees, was also on the board of Citibank with Gerald Ford. You can't make these things up. I've got the signed agreements, confidentiality agreements with Gerald Ford's company and his chiefs of staff, both of them, and the signed legal agreement that they'll negotiate $100 million settlement. They wanted to keep $30 million to bankroll Jeb Bush to become for his presidential run, and I get to keep 70. That was the agreement. They ran away. As soon as they knew I now had definitive evidence that the CIA had destroyed the UN, and now I have the evidence that they destroyed us with David Wong a second time. And then I launched my police investigation. So now we're up to here. I'm now convinced that it's just the octopus, the tentacles of corruption, all in the name of national security. This is what they do. Massive fraud. I was still trusted, even though they destroyed the UN SEAL program, even though they tried to destroy my reputation in Australia, even though they tried to bankrupt me again with my business opportunities in Geneva. It almost bankrupted me because I get tired of doing very good things and seeing them being destroyed by corrupt people. So John Howard agreed, after I reached out to him, to raise the serious matters directly with President George Jr. during his visit to Australia. They can try and destroy me the best they could, but they couldn't break the link that at least I was trusted, and I am known to be right when I do investigations, like I proved in '95, which was on the front page of the newspaper. And they wrote the legal paper called When Ethics Fails and Groupthink Prevails. It turned out everyone knew there was corruption, but no one wanted to do anything about it. And it took me to raise it. No one believed me that it could be possible. And when it was proven that I was right, it was on the front pages of the newspaper. And they had to shut the rorts down. This is the letter, as you've seen in previous ones, that George Bush Jr. unfortunately cut his trip short in 2003. So he couldn't raise the matters with George Bush during his visit, but instead he authorised the Attorney General to start a federal police investigation against John Hopkins. And that's when Kroll Inc., iJet, travel insurance, ECHELON team start work. Because when Robert Booth Nichols came to Australia, he was reciting verbatim confidential correspondence that I had sent by communications electronic to William Hamilton. No one knew, and he repeated certain things. As soon as he was saying it, I knew that he had been provided with a brief from intelligence before he came to Australia, and then he made all these threats after requesting to meet alone with me, insisting that we meet alone. So I had a journalist sitting on the side to witness it. As soon as he finished his last threats, you don't know who you're dealing with until you get a crowbar to the back of the head. You're upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen. If you don't stop, you're going to have the military coming down on you, and all my problems lead to Alexander Haig. He actually said several other things which I'll put in podcasts. He said he knew the name of the chairman of Rupert Murdoch's company that sold the PROMIS software. He contacted the TV channels saying he had evidence that could help me with my John Hopkins case. None of those things were on TV in the program. They were in confidential correspondence being sent to William Hamilton, which means that ECHELON was intercepting them and gave it to him as a brief. Second, he said he was representing a major US investment firm to acquire HealthScope with Ron Evans. Ron Evans I met with Kerry Kriers from John Hopkins the previous year. John Hopkins wanted to acquire his company, Spotless, for cleaning of hospitals throughout Australia and Asia. So the fact that he wanted to meet with Ron Evans, and that's the meeting that Hopkins had set up for breakfast, and we met. And then the last thing was the company that bought Ron Evans's company a few years later was the Kyle Group with Frank Colucci. And so the person that was making the threats looks like identical to Robert Booth Nichols in the Under Siege movie. And he testified that he works for CIA and Frank Colucci to suppress anti-American activities in Australia throughout the 70s and 80s, hence the Loans Affair. It means that Kroll Inc., iJet Travel Intelligence, NSA, CIA, ECHELON, was working overtime during the federal police investigation and the two TV programs identifying the directors, visiting the office of John Hopkins and Amcare Labs, for everyone to see. They were worried. And that's the only reason why President Ford intervened with C. Michael Armstrong, was it wanted to know what evidence I really had. But the minute it knew I had uncovered the CIA Operation Steel Point with the bogus prints, stay tuned for the next one, because it involves the bogus prints, the ambassador of Kuwait, who owns a company with George Bush Senior, Junior, and Neil Bush. Follow the money. It's PROMIS, Project Hammer, Citibank, World Bank. Corruption on a large scale, and for some reason, I'm doing it from the Australian angle, it's PROMIS, ECHELON, and money laundering on a grand scale for covert operations, but it's also for crooks, criminals who are money laundering gold bullion from all countries, US security notes, bank fraud. It's not millions, it's not billions, it's trillions. Next one, let me show you the evidence from Australia that takes the bogus prints all the way up to President Bush, all the way up to President Clinton and the Bush family. That's corruption on a grand scale. And poor Bill Hamilton, patriotic, gets destroyed. Poor Michael, locked in prison for years, nearly 20 years, because he knows. And then have a look at someone like me, who's meant to be in a country that we're an ally to these people, an ally to the US, an ally to defence, intelligence. They've destroyed my companies, they've destroyed my careers, opportunities in Australia and in Europe. And meanwhile, these crooks are all multi-millionaires. In God we trust. Bullshit. They are corrupt. And poor Danny Casolaro and other people like him have just been casualties, fodder. Everyone knows he was murdered. I've presented that in previous podcasts. The evidence, the motives, the key people were never interviewed, and they know he was murdered. And this is the part. It's just the average person thinks that the authorities are going to be there to do the right thing. They don't. That's why when ethics fail and groupthink prevails, that original paper they wrote for me, everyone knew it was corrupt, but no one did anything about it. And when I come along and put evidence on the table that everyone can see, it's like a great big pile of manure sitting there, and everyone knows it stinks, so they want to clean it up. It's been there steaming in front of everybody for ages, but no one would do anything, and that's the only reason why corruption prevails, because good men do nothing. But good men should not let other good men be destroyed financially. That's one thing. Career-wise, that's another. But to take away a life of Danny Casolaro, that's the lowest form of democracy that I've ever seen.